My name is Sara Smith. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a professor of history at American River College, and today's date is April 28th, 2023. Um, so let's start off by establishing the basics. What's your full name? What are your pronouns? And what's your date of birth?
Yeah, my name is Gabriela Abigail Lopez. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and my date of birth is May 13, 2002.
So tell me a little about yourself. What are your interests and hobbies? What do you like to do?
Yeah, I'm 20 years old, currently a student at American River College in Sacramento. Things that I love to do include socializing with my friends, picnics, recently started sports, uh, into playing softball, and spending time with my cat.
So tell me a little bit more about your interest in softball.
Yeah, I recently started softball this spring season with the Sacramento Valley Lesbian and Gay Softball League, and I'm in their rec league, and started up with a team after never having played sports really, because I was limited to that as a kid. And it's been really nice. And there's just a wide range of different types of people and a wide age of ages and backgrounds. And we all just come together and have fun and play softball. And everyone's kind of learning along the way or just for fun. And it's really nice.
Yeah, that sounds like fun. So, where did you grow up and where do you live now?
I grew up in Sacramento, but I was born in Carmichael specifically at Mercy San Juan. And I've always kind of stayed in the Sacramento area for the most amount of time in my life, but I've moved to a lot of different states.
Oh, can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So I lived in California. I was born in California in the suburbs of Sacramento, and I was living there up until about fourth grade. And I moved to Alabama and lived there for about 6 months. And then that was in the southern part of Alabama, outside of Mobile. And after living there, we moved to Louisiana for 6 months. And would also, in case of emergency circumstances, would visit family in Georgia at that time as well. And then finishing up fourth grade, I moved to Honduras for uh, about a month or two, um, and then moved back to Sacramento. spent um, spent 2 years here, um, in the same suburbs, like Carmichael, Citrus Heights area, and then moved to Virginia, um, from seventh grade until freshman year in high school. And that was in Leesburg, Virginia, near the Washington, D.C. area. And after that, I moved to Georgia for like 6 months. At that time, I was like 15. And at 15, I was living with my mom and younger sibling, my younger sister. And we just had a tumultuous relationship. So at that time, I uh, moved back to California with my older sister. And by that point, I was like end of being 15, turning 16 once I moved back to California and lived with her, um, and have been living here since. And now I'm 20, so it's been like almost 5 years. consecutively.
So, does any of your other family live here currently, aside from your sister?
Yeah, so right now, my older sister and her family still live here, and I have my oldest brother, who I believe is around 37. He lives in like the Marysville area, and my mom lives in the area now, and she also lives like in the Citrus Heights area. Um, and my older sibling's father lives in the Sacramento area as well, and I'm still in contact with him too and see him when our families come together.
So why did you move around so much, and what's your connection to the South and to Honduras?
Yeah, so I originally moved for the first time away from Sacramento in fourth grade when my mom married my biological father, who is from Honduras, and she arranged for him to get a visa through her because she was a citizen at the time, and they were able to arrange that. He moved to the Sacramento area. He did not like the work that he was doing, coming from being a teacher and like very well respected in Honduras and like high status, not rich necessarily, but he was very well known by the community in different areas in Honduras. And then coming here and having to do very difficult, like manual, like labor. Um, and so he had an opportunity with an older brother of mine who lives in Alabama, specifically like the town of Bayou La Batre, and that's like the south part of Alabama. And so he lives over there, and he's a welder, and he has been for many years. And he offered my biological father uh, a job that at the time was more than he was earning here in California. And so we decided to move there after the person that my mom was a longtime caregiver for passed away. And that was where we lived. We lived with the person that my mom was taking care of. And after they passed away, she just had this brief moment where she was pregnant at the time with my younger sister, and my dad wanted to be the sole provider of the house, so we would move for him to find a job that he better liked. And so that led us to Alabama, trying out welding, and then in Louisiana, helping out another family friend um, in like the New Orleans suburbs, like Metairie, like area, and they were painting. And he didn't like that either. And so then that led us to go back to Honduras because he said he just couldn't have that big career switch from where he was before and what life is like in reality for people who have to come from another country and reestablish a career and their education not transferring over in equivalency. And so when we got back to Honduras, though, all the um, abuse and um, other, you know, aspects of his character then um, made my mom separate from him because he was a very toxic and abusive person. And once she finally cut off that relationship after it being back and forth throughout all of the different moves, um, we moved back to California, and that's when I did not ever live with him again.
Can you say how old were you again when you moved back?
Um, yeah, I was going into sixth grade. I remember coming back to California and going into 5th or 6th grade, I believe. So around that age, I like 12, I believe, like 13, something like that.
So I think what I'm going to do is ask some questions about your identities and then maybe come back to the questions about family, if that's okay.
Okay.
So, can you tell me how you identify with regard to your social identities, broadly speaking?
Yeah, I would say that I identify as Honduran American. My family immigrated here, so my mom moved from Honduras to California with 3 of my older siblings. And once she settled here in Sacramento, she had me. Um, and I would also say that being queer is part of my identity. I identify um, as questioning, I would say, at the moment. And yeah.
Can you elaborate some? What do you mean when you say that you identify as queer and questioning?
Yeah, queer in terms of sexual orientation. I would say when I was younger, I identified as bisexual, so liking 2 or more genders, and that has just kind of evolved as I've gotten older and understood more about myself. And so now I would say I identify as queer. Also, questioning in terms of like gender orientation. Um, and so I would say that to most of like my social settings, I like identify as a woman, but that's something that I am internally figuring out at the moment.
So, what do you think the difference is between queerness as a social orientation and how you defined your sexual orientation previously as bisexual?
Yeah, I it felt like a um, label that I eventually just didn't feel like defined me. It when I was younger and I was identifying as heterosexual, I knew that I had like attraction to women, but never was able to explore that really or even understand what all of the feelings that I was having meant. And I forgot the train of thought that I was going on. Um, could you repeat the
Yeah,
question for
I
me?
can.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, the difference between queerness as a sexual orientation or what it means to you, and the fact that you previously defined yourself or your orientation as bisexual.
Yeah. So as I've learned more about what each of those terms means, both like in like an academic sense and also my connection to all of those different like identities, um, I was then trying to figure out whether pansexuality was then something that would be best to describe myself because um, 2 or more genders, I felt like still like there was more to it than that. It's not, it wasn't, it felt like it was more described by pansexuality, which is like regardless of gender or anything like that. And then um, just being like, I don't necessarily feel like that fully encapsulates everything also because these like I'm still figuring that out. So then I settled on I believe queer just feels like a very fitting term for how I describe my sexual orientation right now.
Oh, anything else you want to say about your social identities broadly?
Social identities.
So, Honduran American, queer, questioning.
Yeah. Um, which this is also a big part of who I am. I would definitely say neurodivergent, and have disabilities that I also deal with. A lot of those being mental health related, and also different like physical limiting abilities that I would say I don't necessarily um, talk about as much because it's still something that I'm figuring out with my own medical providers, and it's not something that's like a concrete diagnosis that I can go on about and tell you information about, but it's more of trying to figure out what is actually going on.
So what does it mean to you to be neurodivergent?
I would just say that my brain just functions a little differently, and um, in what that means to me is I kind of encapsulate my depression, my anxiety disorder, and my bipolar disorder and my ADHD to go all in that category because they're all, um, different like mental disabilities that just have me navigate the world differently. And I need just a little more um, support, whether that be through means of like therapy and medication to be able to be more comfortable day to day.
Okay, so what about your current class status and your class background? How would you define those?
Yeah, I would say uh, I've always been like lower class and low income. Um, and I feel that that is still true. Um, I grew up with a single mom for the most part, other than brief periods in which she had marriages, but that didn't necessarily change um, my financial status because I was not a part of that necessarily. Um, and I've been working since I was 16, since I was able to. Um, and have been financially independent since then. And um, I don't earn that much. And as of right now, I work part time.
Um, so can you talk some about your coming out experience as queer? What was the process like of figuring out your identity?
Yeah, I would say it happened gradually. More of a lot of inner talk between myself and inner conflict than discussing it too much with everyone around me. So I would talk about it with friends who I felt comfortable with, but not with family. I would say I always knew like as a kid that I wanted to have experiences with women. Um, but I thought that was just normal curiosity, I would say, and was something that I would always keep to myself. And then growing up, even being in a very religious environment, I always remember being taught, like being like against homosexuality and how that was not right. And as a child, not understanding why these adults were telling me that that wasn't right when I thought these people that I had met that were a part of the LGBTQ plus community were really amazing people and just wonderful humans. And um, then after talking with friends about it, like growing up in high school and that, um, then having experiences um, with women and kind of figuring that out between myself, I would have conversations with my one of my older siblings about possibly being queer in some way. Um, I feel like the first time I ever brought it up was probably around like junior high, going into high school. where I was like, I don't think I'm straight. And they kind of dismissed it, and they were like, oh no, well, that's not, like, you've had boyfriends already at this point, and so I don't think that's the case. I think you just want to be a part of this group, and you want this to be like, it just seemed like they were dismissing it as me wanting to be a part of this like club, as if it has not made my life more difficult to be authentically myself. And so that first experience of the first time I ever told a family member and dismissing it, definitely made me not like come out until a couple years later, even after questioning, because part of their points were, oh, well, you don't know that you're queer because you've never had a queer experience. And so how can you say that that's something that you want, or I don't know, wherever that mentality kind of leads to. Um, and so that was something that I would tell myself too, that I couldn't like fully say I identify that way unless I had an experience that I could talk about. Um, but the more I learned um, about bisexuality, queerness, the LGBTQ community, getting older and moving to California and away from my family, my like knowledge on all of those things just expanded, and I was able to verbalize that, like, although you're dismissing this this part of myself that I've been trying to figure out most of my life, like, it is who I am. And although you make a face every time I talk about someone that's um, the opposite gender of me, I is the only time you'll pay attention to my relationships. That's really not okay, and that's like regardless of who you are. So at that point, I became more comfortable just saying things with authenticity to at least siblings. Um, because they understand our family dynamic, and they grew up in the same religious environment, but they're also not in the same generation as like our parents, and most of them are like millennials, and they grew up in the United States. So they're able to understand things a little better from my perspective and be respectful of me and my identity. Or it's just something that with certain siblings I don't talk about as much. But once I started identifying myself socially and to everyone that I would meet as queer, it would still took me a little bit longer to say that um, to like actually to my mom, which was like the biggest like I guess like family figure, um, because she's the one who raised me, and I'm not very close with my dad, nor do I care what he thinks about what I'm doing with my life. Um, but telling her was something that I had played over in my head multiple times because of the way she has reacted to other people and the way I know she already thinks of queer people and growing up and all those things. So all of those comments that she had always made towards other queer people, I felt like were directed at me also. So I remember when I would consult with an older sibling of mine if I should come out with my mom to my mom, they told me that I shouldn't because I'm just trying to cause trouble in our family, and I'm just trying to rile up our mom, or just make her upset just because I'm always like not fitting into the molds that she has kind of made in her mind for me, and then that is just very shocking to her when I don't come out to be a very specific way that she had envisioned. So after so many conversations with that family member of them telling me that they don't think that I should talk to my mom, I eventually just got to a point where I was like, if you don't like kind of at least have like kind of suspect it, then I'm just going to say it. And I didn't want to say it in person because I had already like knew what she was going to say. I knew that she was going to start talking about religious things as soon as I said it. And when I called her a random day, I didn't even ask anyone about it. I was just like, "What are you up?" I just called her on the phone while I was driving near ARC, and I was like, "Hey, like, what are you up to?" And just having a casual conversation. I was like, "Also, I want to tell you something. Like, I like women." Like, and in the best terms that she could understand, I said I was gay. Um, but then I explained to her that it was more like bisexuality in terms of um, liking um, people of the same gender or opposite gender, because she would not be able to understand the like non-binary aspect of like the queer community. So yeah, and she just responded in the way that I expected her to. She was just like, you know, um trying to think of what she said. Probably something along the lines of, that's not right. Like the Bible says that you shall not, whatever the hell they use as justification to be like so awful. And anyways, so I already knew what the spiel was. I was like, yeah, yeah. I was like, I don't expect you to like be accepting necessarily of like m- of the way I choose to live my life, but more of like respectful of me as a person, as your daughter, um, and that all of those like, and that my sexual orientation or gender identity does not change who I was, did not change my childhood, does not change anything about me. Like I did all the things that I did and accomplished while having this internal struggle, and now that I have found myself more, it's something that I feel very comfortable sharing with other people. And I know that part of it is also because she is very religious and she comes from Honduras, and that's where she grew up, and her family was um, also the same way. So I know that it is also because she is still in that headspace.
So, can you talk about how your mom's reaction made you feel when you came out?
Yeah, I would say it made me feel a little sad, but at the same time, I feel like the biggest feeling was relief. And it was mostly because I had envisioned not telling her, and um, being a queer person who never is able to tell their family member. And then they get older, and all of that was just kind of going through my head, and her never knowing, and something happening, and um, wishing I would have been very truthful, even though knowing how she is. Um, so, yeah, it was a decision that I made, I would say, more for myself. I was like, she can kind of deal with the feelings that she has. relating to it, but I'm happy, and this made me really happy that I was able to say that to her. And one of the first things that she said was, I knew it as soon as you got that undercut that something was going on. And um, I thought that was really funny, um, because I just assume that she knows nothing about like queer queer culture, queerness, anything relating to that. So um, I think that that was very funny that she noticed that there was something a little not completely straight about me, um, which was a which was a it was a choice, and she noticed that, and she already suspected something. So it was just to completely um, just mm, prove that, I guess, her suspicion.
So you said that you think her reaction had a lot to do with growing up in Honduras, at least in part, and also her religion. Um, can you maybe elaborate a little bit on both of those?
Yeah, so my mom grew up in a small like village in like Honduras, called Chagalapa, or it's also part of the village is also referred to as Punta Rieles, and that's in the department of Colon in Honduras. And I would say it's a very like small town, and everyone knows everybody, and everyone for the most part is not Catholic. They're Jehovah's Witnesses or Pentecostal or um, evangelical, like Christians. Um, I don't know if I said Catholic, but yeah, there's a big Catholic population there too. But my mom's Seventh Day Adventist, and there's a Seventh Day Adventist Reformed Church in that small village. And she grew up not being very religious, or at least going to church, I don't believe. I think my grandma was like evangelical of some sorts. I think she was a Jehovah's Witness. Um, all I remember is her putting a little scarf over her head when she would go to church. But I have multiple family members in different like sects of like religion in that small town, and it could be one or the other. Um, but my grandma was very like abusive and didn't not was not very kind to my mother growing up. So my mom had to get out of the house very young, and she was around like 13 or 14 when she met my older sibling's dad, and he was like in his early 20s and was working, and I think even if not already was like had connections to the United States in some way. Um, and she just needed someone to provide because that's what she had been taught. So, someone to provide for the household, and also um, someone to get her out of that house because it was very traumatic and very awful. And um, along with that was she didn't really know about like sexual education or anything like that. She didn't know that like she only thought that, and she has told this to me directly, that she thought that women were only to have children. Like she did not know that there was another purpose in life, that she could be something else. Um, so that was her, the environment that she had to grow up in.
So, what's your relationship like now with your mom? Does she acknowledge your queerness or?
I would say that it's a little tumultuous. Um, we have both always had kind of a tumultuous relationship. As I've been in my teens and getting older, um, mostly in the sense of um, we don't get along because of how religious she is. And going from being in the Seventh Day Adventist church to the Seventh Day Adventist Reform movement sect of that church, which is more, I guess, restrictive and more a little more conservative, and um, that affects our relationship because everything that I am is everything that the Bible is basically like, that she kind of points out that the Bible tells me not to be. Yeah. Um, and does she acknowledge my queerness? She knows that I'm queer. It's not something that we talk about that much, other than when she's um, telling me that I shouldn't participate in queer things. Um, like, she just doesn't trust my friends, like any of my friends, because she knows that I am a like I assume she suspects that I'm a big part of the queer community, and she knows probably that I get friends from those different events and that I go to events just to make friends, and she is very standoffish, like, why do you put yourself out there like that? You're not supposed to make friends with strangers like that. Um so it's something that she acknowledges, like, in a negative way. Like, she'll see me put my hair up and she'll see my undercut and she'll tell me that I look like a boy, which is supposed to offend me in some way, and tell me how much she doesn't like it, or tell me how um, like button downs or certain pants make me look like a lesbian, and that she doesn't like that. And she also, I acknowledge that she is worried about the world and them perceiving me that way, and also being hurt or like persecuted in a way because of my appearance.
Does she talk about romantic relationships or, marriage?
Um, yeah, definitely. She would love for me to be married. She got married when she was around 14 or 15. That's also when she first had her first kid. Um, and same with other people in our family. They've all gotten married fairly young. Um, if not in their teens, in their early 20s, or divorced and then remarried by their late 20s, in their 30s. Um, but yeah, everyone just has gotten married very young around me, both in family members that are Honduran, but also because I grew up in a religious environment. Like, everyone gets married very like early because of the whole um, not getting married until not having sex until you get married, so that everyone gets married like at like 22 or like 20, 18. I have so many friends and things that are like friends that are married right now, and so every time I like date someone, but only the men that I like tell her that I date, um, and they treat me good. Like, the first thing is like, just get married, um, because she believes in like getting married, but before living together and all of those things, and um, I've done none of that. But she still holds on hope that I will um, settle down, and just be monogamously with a like cis het man for the rest of my life.
So How do you think your identity as Honduran, as Latinx, shapes your experiences as queer?
Yeah, I would say that I am still exploring queerness within like the Latin, like Honduran culture. And it's something that I would say for specifically like queerness in Honduras are things that I haven't directly experienced. Um, I love like learning about it and all of those things, and I speak from my perspective, but I acknowledge that I am like Honduran American. Like I grew up here, and although I lived like small periods of my life in Honduras and spent a lot of time there, and most of my family lives there, my experience is completely different. Um, and yeah, I would say in the sense of um, being queer, like in America, um, that as I've grown up, I feel like there is more representation, but in looking at people that look like me is just a little different. I would say if I really tried to like look for the content when I was younger, I probably would maybe find some, but I didn't really have access to any of that. Um, so a lot of the queer people that surrounded me growing up and seeing queer influences were very like white, like men and women, or um, more social like media personalities, or in shows and things like that. So people that were famous, but not like day to day people in their lives. And also growing up around primarily um, like like American like middle to like upper middle class um, kids and families at a private Christian school um, in California. I would say I didn't even find people that were Honduran or Central American to begin with. So even coming to terms with my like ethnicity was something that took some time after I moved to Virginia and was surrounded in a public middle school by Mexican, like more like Mexican friends and Peruvian and Salvadorian and all this different types of people that I didn't get to interact with other than in a religious way in California, because I grew up going to a um, Seventh day Adventist church as a child where it was predominantly um, like Hispanic, um, Latinx people. And um, that church um had like also like a lot of Brazilian people, a lot of like people from a lot of different places that just ended up being in California. So I was around people from different countries, but not in a way to learn more about their culture, because it was all centered around um like religious things. And I definitely needed to learn more about like my ethnicity and what it even meant to be Honduran, and people who knew where that was, and um, where that even was on like a map, or people that were like, oh, I know people that are Honduran, and not just not know of its existence. Was nice once I got to middle school and I could relate to these people in certain ways that we were brought up, but also because they didn't were not brought up as religiously as I was, there was also a disconnect there because they were like, how do you not know all the different genres of like music, like a lot of like Spanish um, music, or like I I couldn't tell the difference between the different genres because I never grew up listening to music other than like hymns and religious music or radio music from my older siblings that were playing in the car while we weren't supposed to be listening to secular things. So it was all um, everything that I knew about like the real world was because I was either exposed to it by the people closest to me that were not supposed to be um, like showing me those things, and then me being curious and then going into a public school and being less sheltered and learning things myself and experiencing um, more um, more of my own feelings and becoming a little more emotionally and like intelligent and aware of my childhood and growing up and everything that I had been through, and all of that kind of came at the point of moving to Virginia. That was like a really big like revelatory moment for me.
When you were living in Virginia specifically?
Yes.
How old were you again at that point?
I was about uh 13. Yeah, 14.
So, how did it make you feel to be in community? I mean, I know you said it was complicated, but how did it make you feel to be in community with people who are also Latinx in a way that wasn't just centered on religion? Did it like help you like figure out your own kind of identity in some ways or
Yeah, I would say it definitely exposed me to a part of not necessarily my culture because they weren't all Honduran, but a part of, like, I would say, like, just like Latino, like, culture, like, as like a general kind of experience, um, not from a queer lens. At that point, that wasn't something that I was considering seriously. And so I felt like it made me want to discover more parts about like the specific country that my parents were from. So my Salvadoran friends had all these things that I had seen glimpses of in, for example, like my brother-in-law's family who's Salvadoran, but um it was all just kind of muted because it was censored by religion. So um, music, books, like media, um, and all of that, I did not consume that much of up until like I was curious enough to look and also do that on my own time and not ask parents because if I were to ask questions that were relating to being curious in anything in those topics, they would just dismiss it and give me like a religious spiel about how that's not something that I need to like. That's not good. Like all, like everything that's not godly is like not good. And like any music that's not like talking about God or worshiping God is not good. When I couldn't understand those concepts and I always had a questioning voice in the back of my head, even growing up about all these different things that I wasn't supposed to ask about, I wasn't supposed to experience, and then experiencing them and feeling like I was missing something. But I was also just starting to understand what I was missing.
so you're not religious currently?
No, I am not.
Okay. Um, at what point in your life did you sort of veer from religion, do you think?
I would say I started veering away around, I would say concretely around like 18, 17, 18. When I was around 15, 16, when I moved to California, I was still very much wanted to be a part of community. And after leaving my family, and by that I mean my mom and my younger sister in Georgia, after not getting along and having a really hard time with my depression and anxiety, um, while living together, I was able to think for myself, and think a little more freely, while living with my oldest sister. So I was even able to question and also make start making my own decisions. So if I did not want to go to church, I could possibly not go to church. I had more of a likely chance than not going to church with my mom. And I had events for school, and my older sister wouldn't see an issue with that, and she would let me participate. And whereas my mother would have not let me participate in any dances or things that she would kind of filter to, especially because yes, I was involved in school events in elementary school, but that was when I was a part of the private Christian school. And so any event there was okay. But once it came to public school and doing sports and drama and choir and all of that, some of them were on Saturdays, and because of religious reasons, I wasn't able to do anything on Saturdays, because Seventh-day Adventists recognize the Sabbath or Saturday as a day of rest. So they do not they don't work or do any labor on that day, and like school plays and things like that were also in that. So I wasn't able to participate in school events growing up until living with my older sister. And I just had a lot more leniency with her because she understood that I was a kid who liked all of these things, and something as as like childish, like loving One Direction and going through a One Direction phase as a kid, and my mom telling me that I was worshiping idols and never getting to fully immerse myself in that as much as I wanted to, because I couldn't listen to that music with my mom hearing it. I couldn't put up a poster because I was worshiping idols, and all these things that I wasn't even thinking about. I just really liked the music, and I thought that was super cool, and I was a kid.
So religion was such a central part of your life for so long, and it seems like it had, now that you're not religious anymore, it's like, so basically religion censored these parts of who you are today. That's so you had to sort of come into your identity, into your kind of Honduran American identity, your Latinx identity, your queer identity, without the help of your family, really, because religion censored so much of that growing up. That seems like sort of a, like it must have been incredibly difficult in many ways, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And it was also very hard because, for example, my mom, I would say, is very um, conservative when it comes to religious things, um, rather than like not necessarily my full extended family is like that too. So going to Honduras, I grew up being able to go to Honduras. So when I would go to Honduras, I would see my cousins experience all these things, and um, but I wasn't. But I wasn't really allowed to fully immerse myself. And it was just like I would get these glimpses every time I would go to Honduras, but I would never be able to fully understand it. It was like my mom would be like, that's how they live their life, and we live our life differently than they do. And they party and they listen to music and they dance, and that's not something we do. So yeah, I would say definitely censored a lot of like my identities, and I had to kind of figure that out on my own, and then also connecting with family more and just leaning more into that growing up, because I live in the United States for most of my life in different areas.
Um, you said you moved to California with your older sister when you were 15, 16,
Mhm.
16. And then you started working when you were 16.
Yes.
Um, so can you talk a little bit more about what that was like?
Yeah, so I believe I say like 15, 16 because I believe I was 15 and then turned 16 here. Um, but yeah, I got my work permit as soon as I was able to, and it was also very difficult getting any sort of um, government document done for me because I lived with an older sibling and I wasn't emancipated. So it would make it difficult to get all like I didn't have medical insurance until I turned like 18. And all of these different things that I didn't kind of have access to because I was like in a weird middle spot. I wasn't like foster or like adopted by my older sister. My mom just went to a bank in Georgia and got a piece of paper that I typed into like Google Doc or something. It was like I like and then her name like give and then my sister's name like permission to like enroll her in school and to like fill out any paperwork as her guardian while like in California or something. And then we just got it notarized by someone at the bank. So because the way in which my sister had guardianship over me was so kind of informal, it was difficult to get even situated to get like my work permit, but that got itself figured out. So at 16, I started working at a doctor's office, and I got that job through a um, old teacher of mine, like an elementary school teacher of mine, whose whose husband has their own practice, and so they reached out to me and asked if I would be willing to help them out with like medical records. So that's how I started off. That job was by working as much as I was allowed to with a work permit in California at the time, which I'm not sure, but definitely part time. And I eventually would work there more often as I got to turning 18 and then how much I was like legally allowed to work. So then I ended up starting to work full time eventually there and went from doing medical records and saving all their paper medical records and digitizing all of them that they had stowed away. I became a receptionist and was a receptionist for, I believe, a year until I stopped working there. So I think I worked there for a total of around like 3 years. Um, and after that, I've had other kind of jobs in between, being a caregiver, um, and then I started another job in the medical field, being a pharmacy technician, and that's what I'm still currently doing. And I've been there for about 2.5 years. Um, I was out of work for about a year in 2022 due to a disability. But I had already gotten licensed and had been working with CVS for a while at that point.
So did you like struggle financially? Do you think by the after what like when you moved to California and then in the ensuing years?
Yeah. So my mom was not financially responsible for me once I moved to California, so that made it a little difficult. My older sister, when I moved in with her, I moved in with also her her husband and her two kids, but they're a little more financially secure than my mom, which actually I should say a lot more financially secure than my mom, who was like a single mom with um, like a preschool um, actually, I think when I moved away from my mom, my little sister was around like first grade or something like that. So my little sister was young, and childcare was something that was a worry for my mom, and I was um, primarily taking care of my sister when I did live with her, and me leaving required her to uh, actually find someone to take care of my little sister. Um, and she didn't have money like to spare to be able to send money for me while I lived in California. So my older sister would just provide basic necessities for me and was financially responsible for me um, up until I started working. And then I had my own money. And as I started having my own money and building up my own savings, and everything that I would buy would then be um, from my money. And um, as I started earning more money and working more, I do remember that I ended up starting to pay rent. Like before I turned 18, wasn't significant amount, but I worked part time, so like $300 or $400 from working and earning like 12. I think at the time I was like 12, $13 an hour I was earning. Um, that was like a significant amount of my check, and I just had to be able to manage my money myself while taking care of everything that I needed to.
So have you ever experienced homelessness and or near homelessness? And can you talk a little bit about that experience if you have?
Mm-hmm. So I um, experienced um, homelessness after moving back from Honduras and coming back to California. Because it followed a period of moving from state to state within the US, and then my family spending their savings through all of those moves. And Honduras was just the last resort where they spent kind of the remaining amount of money that we had. And I believe we might have had to even borrow or just use the last bit of money that we had to get back to the US. And that was a ticket for me and my mom. And I don't know if she had to pay for my younger sister's ticket because of her age at the time. Um, so when we got back, we were very financially unstable. And we lived with a family friend um, because they had a family member that needed help in their house. And so my mom was a caregiver. So they said, you can live in the house if you take care of this family member. So that's what we did. And so it was me, my mom, and my little sister living there for a short period. And then my older sister was living in El Salvador for a short period of time with her family. So at that point, it was my brother-in-law and my one of my nieces, and they were there because they had to get his papers sorted out, and part of that process was him having to move back to El Salvador and wait for his residency paperwork to finalize. And after that happened, they were also looking to come back to the U.S. and we didn't have another place other than where we were staying. So they also made a agreement for my oldest sibling and their family to also move into that house. And so all of us were there in this 3-bedroom house, each of us with our own rooms, 3 people in them, and then the elderly person. And they got in a falling out with the family member that managed things for the elderly person that my mom was taking care of, and they had a really bad falling out, and they kicked out my entire family from where they were, which was also their living situation. And because everyone had just gotten back from Central America, they didn't have any money saved up, nor did we have like a set job because my mom was getting paid through a family member cash. They didn't have proof of income. Their credit was probably not the best. They also didn't have the best rental history because they had to leave so quickly that they kind of left themselves in a not great spot to rent another place when they moved back. So we, for a couple weeks, were just in this weird limbo period where we were living in like motels and hotels, and it would go from like a little nicer ones to, as we started running out of money, like less like hygienic and safe places. So, and that was where everyone would pitch in for the room. So we started off having like a separate room from my oldest sister and her family, even though we're going through the like same thing, to then by the end of it, all getting one little nasty motel room where we all slept together. And like that was where we had to like find out how to figure food out. And I think we were definitely like on government assistance at the time, and that was what was helping us a lot also. And it was just like a middle point in between trying to figure out how to get an apartment. And I think after like a few weeks of that, they were able to find like this this apartment complex in Carmichael that was like a friend of a friend. And that's truly how we kind of got the apartment, was because everyone's credit was not the best. They didn't have all this money. They were able to scrounge acquire a bunch of like money here and there from like different people's like kind of savings, or borrow money from family that they then had to pay back, and got that apartment. And it was a 2-bedroom apartment. And I remember there was the master had had bunk beds and then like another bed. And so the bunk beds were for me and my younger sister, and my mom slept on the other bed, and then the other room, which was for my older sister and her husband and my youngest niece. And eventually, after getting that place, we were then able to restart looking for work and kind of get more situated after we had stable housing. And eventually, one of my other older brothers moved in with us, and he lived in our living room, and so it was all of us in that apartment.
How old were you at the time?
Um, I I always think of things in terms of like grades because I kind of cluster a lot of memories in terms of what grade I was in and what was kind of happening. So I was uh, fifth or sixth grade. I remember going to school while that was happening at home and going to like a private Christian school that I was there with a like fee waiver, like someone was sponsoring me and I didn't have to pay any of the tuition that people normally have to pay. Um, and so I would go to this school with all the other little middle class families, and I would bring like a cup of noodles that we've been eating a lot of cup of noodles for like consecutive days because there was like not other food that we could really cook where we were at and like take to school and like space for all of that. So it was very like I acknowledged um my like economic class when comparing myself to the kids that I would go to school with as a kid, and I recognized that I was in a different living like circumstance than the other kids.
And that was for elementary school.
Mm-hmm.
And where did you go to middle school and high school?
I went to the private Christian school up until um, I finished sixth grade there, and then I moved to Virginia for seventh and eighth grade and went to a middle school there, and then
Was it a public school?
I was a public
Okay.
school, yes. And then I went to ninth grade at a public high school in Virginia also, and then um, yeah, for the most part, public schools after that.
So when you moved to California and you were around 15, 16, you went to a public school, a public high school.
Yes. Yes, I went to Mira Loma and I was there for half a semester in 10th grade. Because as a sophomore, I did my first semester in Georgia and I lived there for a few months and then moved to California in January of my sophomore year. And then I started 11th grade and then finished high school at Visions in Education, which is like a public charter school. So it was mostly online. And that's how I was able to have a job at 16 and also work. Have a job and also go to school. And also, I was taking community college classes when I was like in high school still. So that allowed me the time to do all of that.
Did you ever struggle in school because of moving around quite a bit, being low income? I don't know. Did you struggle because of religious stuff? Yeah.
I would say I I had different struggles based on where I was living. So I would say freshman year of high school, I was having a lot of trouble with mental health. I had a really difficult mental health moment during the period between eighth grade and ninth grade. And then going into ninth grade after having a hospital stay for mental health reasons, and then um, starting this new environment was a struggle. I would say that I had a very difficult time like at home, so that was a big struggle. At public school, I didn't notice my financial differences from my friends as much because my friends were all experiencing the same thing. My friend group in Virginia was mostly like Hispanic, like Latin people. So we together would come together and point out the differences that we saw between us and living in the richest county in the United States at the time, and there being such rich, like white privileged people, and acknowledging our differences.
Um, did you have any experiences, like, what were your experiences as somebody who was queer identified in high school, generally speaking?
Mm-hmm. I was not out to people around me directly up until maybe around 11th grade. So I would say 10th grade, I was still definitely figuring that out more for myself, as like a possibility. And then moving to California and then finding friends that were also kind of going through the same thing. And also having a childhood friend that I, funnily enough, ran into my first day at a public school in Sacramento, who was a childhood friend of mine, and we would have sleepovers in preschool. And the only person that I was ever allowed to stay over and participate kind of in their family as such a young child and being so sheltered. We ran into each at my first day at public high school, and seeing that they were figuring themselves out just as much as I was, and that they were also out of their private school situation that they had been in and graduated from in 8th grade, and were asking to please be sent to like a regular school, so a public school, because they didn't want to be there anymore because they were very bullied and it was just not a good experience. So seeing someone else come to terms with their identities and what it meant for us to be Hispanic, and uh, she's Honduran, she's half Honduran, half Mexican, and I'm Honduran, and seeing how our moms are both Honduran, very strong women who had to endure a lot of very difficult things, and us kind of working on our generational trauma and addressing these things that had not been addressed by family. And I would say that I definitely found reassurance in meeting her, and from meeting her and connecting with her and being closer, then meeting other people that were going through the same thing was definitely reassuring, and helped me to be more confident in myself and who I was and how I presented myself to everyone.
Was this friend also queer identified?
Yes. I don't know if they identified as queer when we reconnected again, but yes, they identify in the queer spectrum.
So do you, when you did come out and you sort of figured out your own queerness, were you out at school? Did you have any experiences sort of interacting with staff, faculty, other students that you remember that were about being queer or in response to you being queer?
I remember before coming into my queer identity being just a very, very confident ally and wanting to be involved in those spaces in a supportive way as much as I could. And I would say I would still try to participate in those groups and in those communities, but it was kind of a fuzzy switch from realizing that um, I'm not just an ally and that I identify as being also part of the like LGBTQ plus community. But in terms of experiences at school, I remember like GSA was like the biggest group to join at school, if not like the only like consistent like queer um, club at my schools. And I would say I was friends with maybe people who participated in it, but I wasn't super involved in those groups. And that's also because I was living with family. And although, yes, this was something that I was questioning in different uh, points in high school, I wasn't able to join clubs and be a part of any of those things. And especially if my family found out, they would have been very upset.
Do you remember any of your teachers talking about anything queer in the classroom?
I would say not really. Other than there are always those few teachers that stand out that really were just gave all these queer students kind of struggling in the different environments that we were in, whether that be Virginia or Georgia, that are more conservative and also um, in that way. And so there were a few professors that were very like welcoming and understanding. And I would say I know a lot of queer students would then kind of lean on these teachers that were very welcoming. But it was like either they were like that and they would put so much emotional like and like be vulnerable with these people with these students and creating those connections, or it's just not talked about, or it's just glazed over because it's part of like the school statement that has to be included in a syllabus that they are inclusive, but in reality it's just a little paragraph that has to be included, and that's not reinforced. Like no one in high school was asking really about pronouns and um, the difference between like sexual orientation and gender and all of those things. That wasn't um, something that you were really able to learn too much about, other than in like a medical science way, briefly, other than the teachers who were a part of that community or were allies to that community that were um, outspoken of being a safe space for people from that community. Those were the exceptions.
Do you think those teachers were queer themselves?
I, yeah. Um, I'm not sure if at the time, or maybe I just wasn't aware, but I know um, two teachers, and specifically that stand out with my brief time, only being there a semester in Georgia, that um, were a safe space to talk about my kind of tumultuous house life. And at that time, struggling with my queer identity wasn't even one of the like primary struggles I was dealing with at the time. It was mostly my relationship with my family and depression and anxiety. And that that me being queer was not even something that I could um, put as a forefront of my life. And it wasn't until I moved to California.
So, where do you go to community college and what do you study?
I currently go to American River College in Sacramento. I've also taken one class within the same community college district at Folsom Lake College. And it's my last semester at American River College, and I will be graduating with an associate in science and an associate in social sciences, and hoping to go into the medical field and major in health science once I transfer.
Where are you transferring to?
I'm still applying right now, but uh, I got into Sacramento State and Cal State East Bay, and applied to Portland State University also. So just waiting on the last decision, and then compare financial aid packages and to see what benefits me the best.
Why did you choose to attend community college?
I would say it was not something that I had anticipated doing. I was originally planning on going to a 4-year university and did the application process and got accepted into everywhere that I applied to. But I would definitely say I did not know anything about college at all. Like none of my family members have finished college. So I was just kind of left on my own to figure out what to do. So yes, I applied to all these places, but I didn't really know what that meant financially. I I didn't think I don't even know if I was even able to interpret financial aid packages and what that meant and what loans are. I'm still figuring that out. So I was then told that the California has the 2 years of community college free, and that once I learned about that, it was kind of a just no brainer of well, this is the way that I can go to college and um, dip my toes in like the professional like field that I want to go into while working towards my education and something that I know that I would qualify for.
So do you feel supported as a queer student at the community college level? Do you feel supported in your other identities at your college?
I would say I have definitely leaned on support from the DSPS office the most at American River College. So I am in communication with people from that office, and specifically my counselor is wonderful. And I I do not have contact with like the Pride Center. I know there's like the Unite Center also. Um, I haven't really been in communication with them as much. I sometimes like see flyers of different like events going on, but most of like the like kind of social events and things like that, I don't really have time to be able to attend all of those. So the DSPS office is, I would say, mostly like guidance and things that I get very confused about, and a counselor that will be patient and not just tell me to figure it out on my own, but help guide me a little more. Um, because the experiences that I had had with counselors before the DSPS services and their counselors um, was a lot more of a struggle to navigate.
Oh, so can you talk a little bit more about that? Why it is that you've relied on DSPS? So how have your disabilities influenced your time as a community college student?
Yeah, so the reason that I've let like leaned so much on the DSPS office is because of like the bad experiences with counselors just when you go into the counselors center. I I know that they're always extremely busy. It's hard to get a hold of the office by phone, and I remember the pandemic made that worse. And counselor's appointments would go so quick. You have to call basically when they open, and that's hard for people that have jobs that open at the same time. Um, and there was never availability. Yeah, I would always end up seeing like a different person every time that wouldn't understand my circumstances or situations, and I would kind of have to explain that every single time to a new person. And also people that didn't uh, didn't have like the information that I needed. Like they would the people at the just counselor's office that I had seen, I had one like not great experience of them just telling me that like what I wanted to do or the path that I wanted to take wasn't like the right way. And I guess I would say an issue that I was having was that the counselors just kind of had told me that this was the way I needed to complete what I needed to complete in order to do my general education and transfer in California. But they would only specify very specific classes that in within those requirements. So within like the I get C's, they would just tell me, oh, you can do U.S. history for history. They wouldn't tell me that like like in like the student handbook there were like all these different classes that classify under um, that fulfill that same requirement without having to take US history for like the third or fourth time in my life. So I basically had to do like my own research and I had my own document and like my own like paperwork that I would keep track of my classes and compare them to the actual like student like I get see chart rather than just going by what they would tell me. And I have had so many different classmates tell me that they've also had the same experience, that they're just recommended like a few classes within the group that they are able to take. And like they didn't even know that US history, African American emphasis also fulfills that, or that women's history fulfills that too. Um, we just weren't informed, and if you did not put the extra effort in going through all of those complicated documents and all of those um, like transfer requirements, um, you wouldn't know, and you'd be stuck taking like the most general classes of the list.
So how would you say that your experience in the classroom has been shaped by your identities, including your disabilities?
I would say that I've struggled in terms of my disability and being in the classroom. I think that um, I have um, I have used a lot of the services that DSPS offers, but it's not that much to kind of begin with. So the options, are the like I know that they may help some people with different disabilities. But as for my disabilities, the only thing that would really apply in terms of helping me in the classroom would be extra exam time, which is, yes, nice, but also does not encapsulate the struggles that I do have in a classroom. And most of the accommodation then would come from individual professors, which can be good or bad depending on your professor. So if you have a professor that acknowledges students' disabilities and students' circumstances and that are understanding of that and working with their students and acknowledging that it's not that they're bad students, but that they are in different circumstances and that their lives are not just school. Um, that then that's how your kind of experience is shaped, is based on those people. And if you have a professor that is not understanding, then you struggle a lot, and that's where a lot of people get discouraged.
So, what would you like your professors to know about how they should educate, how they should accommodate neurodivergent and disabled students?
I would say the way that a few professors have approached it with me, and that I feel like has been very helpful, is when they do have like kind of questionnaires like at the beginning of the semester, and whether that be like online or paper or whatever that may be, of like getting that information from students of um, not only addressing like different abilities, learning like learning and physical, but also their identities. So like acknowledging pronouns and what their preferred names are, and um, like how to address them in class, if that's something that is there anything else that you would like to speak like one-on-one with me about? And not necessarily addressing it in front of the whole classroom, but being able to spend more one-on-one time with the students to get to know every student's kind of circumstance. But I do acknowledge that that requires a lot of like effort on on teachers' parts, and especially if they're extremely overworked, they may not be have the time with to be able to do that with like every single student like in depth. But I think that even that like first like acknowledgement like just helps tremendously in how the rest of the semester goes, regardless of if that student continues being a student and completing that class, or if they need support in different ways and are just not able to take the class due to different circumstances. I think teachers are still like able to make a really big impact, and I've had professors that have made really big impacts on my education at American River College that I would say did so not based on a document that DSPS gave them that told them how they need to treat me and the accommodation that they need to give me.
Can you talk some about your experience taking courses that either wholly or in part focus on queer and trans topics?
Yeah, I would say that I've only taken like 2 or 3 classes that have involved like gender, like sexuality, like sexual orientation in its topics, and that would be the queer studies course that I took, the women's history course, and also psychology courses. So those were the courses that I feel like I got more information from. For example, obviously the queer studies class is an introduction class, and that's what we talk about. Introductory to so many different like types of queer history that it was so fascinating, but also difficult to get all the information from all those different subjects in different places, and also with it being an introductory class, trying to get over the first like hump of people like being like able to understand, and people that are there because they're queer or people that are there because they want to learn. And so people just kind of come in with different levels of knowledge and experience. So sometimes certain topics that some students may have more experience with or knowledge about will have to be reiterated to people who are just now starting, which makes sense. Like it's an introductory class, but there's no follow-up to that class, at least offered right now, unless you want to go to a 4-year. And with the women's history class, I would say there was definitely, we definitely analyzed and acknowledged the like queer experience, but it was also primarily like for like women. And I would say that it also included like women, people of color in both of those classes. And it wasn't that was a really big, like a big thing that also I realized that I didn't really learn that much about was like history of people of color, like more indigenous history, and Black history as well, and like, and then for the psychology classes, it's more of learning it in a clinical sense. So for like my abnormal psychology, going into gender dysphoria and what that is um, as a clinical diagnosis, and all of these different mental disorders um, that people had, and queerness being classified as that at points in history, and how that was dealt with around the world and things like that.
So, why did you choose to take courses that focus on queer and trans topics? Why do you think it's important to include these topics in courses?
I decided to take it because I'm queer, and when I first started at community college, I didn't even know that was an option of classes to take. So it came along with me seeking more knowledge about people within the community and wanting to learn more about it. But I had to put the initial effort to look for those classes, like I said earlier, because they weren't necessarily suggested or as advertised as other courses. So it was like, yes, I would love to take this queer history class, but I didn't know that it would cover one of like my credits or sections for what I was trying to fulfill for my gen eds. And I just dismissed it because I was like, no, like I'm a science major. I don't think this is going to be covered at all under my financial aid. And that was the issue. Was it's not that I don't want to take these classes where I just want to learn the information, but a lot of students also don't know that these classes could be covered under their financial aid if you just kind of work with um, the transfer chart and where it like satisfies the requirement for it. But they don't know that unless they really have to look for it.
So, how did you find out about the queer studies course?
I think I I saw it um, in that like I get see chart that it fulfilled for one of like the either like social science. I don't remember which one I needed it to fulfill, but I just had it in a Google Doc of these are all the classes that you can take, and I would just write out the abbreviations for every class. Like these are all the classes that you can take, but they always have them as like Psych 340 or SJS 310, and people don't know what that means. So you would have to literally go into the catalog and type every class out and see what it is, and that's what I did until I found one that I'd be interested in. Because the thing for me is that I wanted a class that I was not only excited to learn about, um, but that like I also wanted to make more connections in, and something that I would also see as like growth for me, whether like academically or just meeting other people that I identified with.
Um, so, what is it? I guess, do you feel like in a class like queer studies that focuses on um, at least some of your identities or part of your identity, does it feel like you're more invested in the class, that you can do better in that kind of class? Or like, what do you think the importance of that class is for your sort of investment in your own education and your sense of belonging and well-being on campus?
Yeah, I would say it helped a lot in feeling seen on campus. Seeing a class that covered so many topics that need to be covered in the general classes of those like subjects, but that aren't. So it all then became encapsulated into this one introductory course. So it's like these needed to be covered in like intro history. This needed to be covered in like intro to like psych, and not in like further like deeper down, like that is like the basis, the first level of like intro to queer studies, but it's not a different sector. It's intertwined in all the other subjects. And that's just not how it was taught. Like that's not how it's presented in like the courses.
So if you could imagine a course or multiple courses that either focus wholly or in part on queer and trans topics, what additional topics, what would you like to learn about queerness? Like, are there, yeah, if you think about what else there is to learn, and what would you like to learn more about?
Um, I would say I would like to learn about queer history in every subject. So like, um, like for example, when I take a like history class, I don't want it just to be from this very specific like Eurocentric perspective and lens. Um, when there are other things going on that people of color are doing, whether that be if like the class is based on like geographical location or time period, um, like there are things going on in queer history in like big history for people of color. Like it's ridiculous that we're only learning it now until college, and even then I'm at like the end of my community college experience, and it wasn't until um, the semester before my last that I found queer studies, that I found women's history, and that I realized that I could use it to continue my education, and that it's something that I am interested in, and would possibly like to have my career like intertwined with that as well, because it helps me understand how important it is for um, different careers to also see from this lens, the queer lens, like also from a lens of disability, from a lens of um, like having an immigrant family and all of these different things that make up who I am, and um, even finding the vocabulary within these classes to be able to express myself better and to understand myself better, and then to be able to tell other people as well and communicate that with my family.
So, is there anything else you would like to add about the importance of having a more inclusive curriculum, a more inclusive classroom space with regard to queer and trans students, and students living at the intersection of multiple identities, including your own identities as disabled and Latinx and low income and so on?
Yeah, I would say that there's so many hoops to jump through, and that makes it very difficult for everyone. In regards to different like aspects of, I would say, speaking from personal experience, like my identities, like um, finding classes that were accommodating, professors that were understanding was just, like luck, or people that I know too that also took those professors, or like kind of word of mouth from other people. Um, and then there's also like the negative side of it, like people that they're like, this professor was not very great and was very not understanding of my circumstances, and that I am like chronically ill, or things like that. And um, I would say like asking students more of like what they need, because it's like the DSPS office can't just stop at that. Like that can't be that's it for student services. Like that doesn't encapsulate everyone's um, disabilities. is like extra exam time, or you know, for other people there are people that will help take notes for you. There are tutors. There are also I believe professors also are able to provide like auditory content that's also like written out, that has transcripts, and I think that's very helpful. Um, but professors that just do that regularly without being asked, it is very helpful. Like professors that don't just give lectures, like audio lectures online without subtitles, and just kind of expect students to be able to exactly like understand what they're saying and the audio to be okay, and then also just like missing things and not being able to go back and trace it. And I think just the accessibility just needs to be just like a norm, not just for specific people, but there are people that are also neurodivergent and have disabilities that aren't diagnosed, and that's another problem, because if they're not diagnosed, they can't be like a part of the DSPS offices, like services or like assistance, because um, they need the provider to write that out and to have that as a medical diagnosis. I would say help getting medical related assistance is also really big, especially at a community college, which is kind of a transition period for a lot of people, and going from being, you know, either like in your teens to being an adult, or there are people that are older and like veteran services and all those different things. But um, I know that at least for me, when I was struggling with like mental health services, like the online services that they provided for counseling weren't helpful. And that like the counselors, because I didn't even feel like comfortable with like the regular counselors talking to them about academic stuff, I never was able to be like emotionally vulnerable either with the counselors that were also supposed to be there for that reason, or supporting through those things. I would say that like certain high school counselors and even middle school counselors were more there emotionally and more like attentive and checking in on students than in community college.
So have you ever felt harassed or discriminated against because of your queerness on campus?
I would say I personally haven't noticed um, being discriminated against. Most likely because I'm not very involved in the campus, and I just kind of come to take my classes and spend time with the people that I know and leave. And also because um, the way I dress for the most part is very gender conforming, like, and so no one's very questioning um, my identity, um, like outwardly in my appearance, and that's normally I would say like when a lot of like discrimination happens is when you just look a little different than um, everyone else, like noticeably. So unless someone asked me and started getting to know me, I would say I kind of slip under the radar.
Have you been in a classroom in which a student or a professor has said something that is harmful in any way, like harmful toward about the queer community?
I would definitely say that there have been professors that have been just a little like insensitive in their comments. They don't obviously, if someone is not like outwardly like gender fluid or something that challenges gender norms, um, then they wouldn't know what the demographics of the class are. So I've definitely remembered like maybe like comments that were like insensitive maybe to like the queer community, or especially a lot of things that I acknowledge that would be very harmful to people who are non-binary in a learning environment that doesn't very much acknowledge that, unless the professor is an ally and chooses to address that and watch their language when talking about things.
Um, so how important do you think queer community is for your own sense of well-being at the college, but also just more broadly?
I would say the queer community is definitely um, like my second family, in the sense of the community that I've made in Sacramento. It's the people that I feel like know me most authentically and that accept me for for how I am and see me for how I am, and don't try to put me in a box and this is who Gaby is and this is who Gaby has always been and this is who she is going to be. It's like that's they learn about who I was, who I am, and who I'm going to be is kind of left up to me, and that's like how it should be. Um, and and it's definitely like saved me in the sense that I've had a very religious environment growing up and very like conservative, and growing up learning that like everything that I am is not okay, based on the religion that my family kind of follows and the way they interpret it. The queer community has just kind of been my other home of like understanding other people's similar experiences, and not only experiencing like frustration and loss and like discrimination and all of these things and understanding that, but also like celebrating where we all are in all of our different ages, where we're at, what we've accomplished, and like be able to just experience like queer joy together and be able to have a, a community no matter how old we are and how long it took us to find it.
Okay, anything else you would like to add? Anything you'd like to elaborate on?
I would definitely say that um, teacher like training would help also a lot in how to manage and how to allow people from different identities to feel safe when they are going to school. And no matter like how big of a part or small of a part like school is to them, whether they're there full time and that's what they do, or they're working, or they have kids, or they only take classes for fun. Like it doesn't matter like kind of where the student is at, but there are so many different aspects to students' individual identities um, that make up their academic success. And I think that if teachers were like trained better on how to handle students with neurodivergent um, neurodivergent like they are neurodivergent like neurodivergent students, that 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 would make a huge impact, and for them to start not only seeing it from one single perspective in terms of how do we help the disabled community? How do we help the Hispanic community feel seen? How do we help the like Black students feel seen and Asian Pacific Islander students be seen? But it's like it's not they don't just come in these specific groups. Like they come there's people with multiple different layers to their identity, and like how do we help trans disabled students? Like how are we going to help um, in like their experience in community college and the discrimination they face, and um, because there are students that face discrimination, and I have friends that do, and people that are misgendered all the time, and um, that don't need to put themselves in, you know, vulnerable positions to be respected by their peers and also the staff. It needs to be something that needs to be addressed to everyone, and it doesn't need to just be the queer students that have to bring this up in order for something to happen.